Welcome again to another episode of the Christian Forum on Israel-Palestine, where we have the great pleasure to interview today Ruth Padilla DeBorst. Um, we called this episode Gaza Through Latin American Eyes, a global conversation with Ruth Padilla DeBorst. I hope you will find this particular approach particularly enlightening. This is a particularly timely podcast or live stream to initiate, as just today, I believe it is, the ceasefire agreement has been broached between Hamas and Israel and the IDF and Netanyahu and company. We pray and hope with the people of Gaza that this will bear much fruit and lead to constructive steps in the future. So let us, with no further ado, my co-host Bruce Fisk, excuse me, is joining me now, and we are going to be beginning with Ruth immediately. Welcome to our live stream, Ruth. I will try not to butcher your name like I just did my good friend Bruce here. Let me give a quick summary of your CV, Ruth. You were born in Colombia. Your mother was an American, Catherine Fezer Padilla, and your father was the famous Ecuadorian theologian and missiologist, someone I read back in seminary days, Rene Padilla, who coined the phrase integral mission to bring attention to the church's vocation in both evangelism as well as in the struggle for justice. You earned your MA in interdisciplinary studies at Wheaton College in '87 and your PhD in theology from Boston University in 2016 under the supervision of the esteemed church historian Dana Robert. You've, in your own work, as I understand it, you've carried on your father's vision for integral mission, being an advocate for a type of evangelical liberation theology.
Dr. Padilla DeBorst is former president and general secretary of the Latin American Fellowship, or Fraternidad Teológica Latinoamericana. Dr. Padilla DeBorst was a keynote speaker at Lausanne 2010, the Evangelical Conference held in Cape Town, South Africa, and again last year in Seoul. She's also given addresses at Christ at the Checkpoint conferences in Bethlehem in 2018 and 2024. Ruth lives with her husband, James Padilla DeBorst, in San Jose, Costa Rica.
In the fall of 22, Ruth joined the faculty of Western Theological Seminary as the Richard C. Outerslice Associate Professor of World Christianity. That's just down the road from me. She currently divides her time between the seminary in Holland, Michigan, and the Comunidad de Estudios Teológicos Interdisciplinarios in Costa Rica. Bienvenida, Ruth Padilla DeBorst. We'll begin with a few questions from us and then expand the conversation to include some more of our colleagues that are waiting in the wings. Can we just jump in, or that was a long intro? Anything you want to say before I jump right into the first question?
Let's go.
Yes, it's an amazing day to think of this possible. We pray that it'll actually happen and be thoroughly abided by on all parts.
Amen. Yes, indeed. Well, how about we begin with Misión Integral? Tell us about Misión Integral. As I understand it, the paradigm originated in the context of the university student ministry in Latin America in the 1950s and was amplified by your father, Rene Padilla's work in the 70s, at around the same time that Gustavo Gutierrez, next door in Peru, was developing a theology of liberation. So what is Misión Integral? And I'll just follow up with a parallel question you can answer together. Should we translate that term in English as holistic mission? How should we understand this?
Yes, so the term integral is kind of comes from, if you have a whole grain with none of its constitutive parts taken out. So pan integral is whole wheat bread. arroz integral, is whole grain rice. And the point being that both the gospel and the calling, the mission of the church in the world, is integral. It has to do with all dimensions of life. We don't take any constitutive part out of it. We don't pick and choose one ingredient or another. We say the gospel has to do with all dimensions of life, and consequently, the work of the church in the world has to do with all dimensions of life. So we engage, yes, with our vertical relationship with God, but we also engage with relationships with others, with people, and with the whole of creation. And so, yes, it has to do with our personal prayer life, but it also has to do with seeking justice in the world. And possibly a summative verse is what we find in Micah 6:8, where God calls us to a humble relationship with God, but also to live and seek love, mercy, and seek justice in the world. And so a proper term in English, yes, you could maybe talk about holistic, but it actually, many people around the global south especially have already adopted the term integral and calling it integral mission as a way of summing up this holistic perspective.
Excellent. That's very helpful. So how did it emerge exactly? How has this framework shaped your own work as a theologian and as a practitioner? But how did did your father come about with this language?
Yeah. So a lot of this had to do with looking at a church and expressions of Christian faith that were somewhat alienated from the realities of the context, and just importing theologies and priorities from outside our region, when the region was racked with revolutionary fervor, with dictatorships, with extreme inequality, with injustice, all these things. And the question was, is there any good news? Does the gospel have anything to say and to live and to propose in the midst of this reality? So it was out of that context, very effervescent context, that the response was, yes, if the gospel is good news, it must address these issues. And so that's how it kind of emerged. And definitely it's part of how I was shaped both in my family, my local church, the Christian student movement, the Latin American Theological Fellowship. And that's what we seek to further both in our own lifestyle here as part of this community I'm a part, Casa Adobe, an intentional Christian community, through our teaching and through the community of interdisciplinary theological studies, through Infimit, this global network of theologian practitioners seeking to further integral mission around the world. So it's definitely just the air I breathe and the goal I pursue in life.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. I'm guessing this weaves organically to my next question. Your approach with Misión Integral is certainly you're certainly going to say in some way, shape, or form that it was behind how you became engaged with Palestinian theology and the pursuit of justice and peace in Israel-Palestine. So maybe you can tell me a bit about that journey. How does Misión Integral inform how you yourself are responding to the crisis in Gaza and in Palestine as well?
Yes. So I was privileged to be encouraged by an old Dutch American missionary, Sidney Roy, who was very close to my family. So from already in my teenage years, I was hearing about the realities in the Middle East, and particularly burdened by the lack of attention being given to those realities, and actually even the fact that they were being emphasized by people who identify as Christians without a whole lot of discernment about what was really happening and what our call should be. So definitely the understanding that the pursuit of justice is an integral part of the gospel and consequently of the mission of the church drew me in. I began reading, and then, of course, I had the incredible opportunity of spending several weeks in Palestine when I worked for World Vision, and we spent time in the desert with Musalaha and just got a feel for the plight of people and the reality. Became good friends with people like Munther Isaac and Jack Sarah and others over there. And so that began a deeper, it wasn't just a cognitive journey. I know this stuff, but it actually became an experiential and deep set passion that then was nourished as I engaged with Christ at the Checkpoint and had opportunities to engage there. And then through my studies in social ethics for my PhD, we began reading far more widely people like Mark Ellis and Naeem Atik. So it's just been a building through time, through people, through reading, through the personal engagement in the land.
Excellent.
If I could pick up on that, you mentioned Mark Ellis, Jewish, recently passed Jewish liberation theologian who taught at Baylor for many years, and Naeem Atik, of course, Anglican in Palestine, in Jerusalem, sort of the father of Palestinian liberation theology. And then here where I am in Peru, recently passed is Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of, I guess you could say, liberation theology, or at least the Catholic expression of that. And one of the things that seems to tie a lot of these different theologies of liberation together is sort of a reading from below, a reading from the perspective of the poor or the oppressed, sort of a hermeneutic that drives them all. Would you agree? Sounds like you're agreeing with that. Would you want to say that there's a lot in common? I mean, there's many more liberation theologies now. There's liberation theologies in Africa, there's Black liberation theologies. What is at the center of the theology of liberation that you would commend? And maybe how does that connect perhaps to your brothers and sisters in Palestine who are advocating something similar?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the what comes to mind immediately is Mary's Magnificat. I've just been teaching a course on narrative theology and life, and there's a beautiful little book by Valdir Steuernagel on doing theology with Mary, and you can't avoid thinking about the Magnificat, this incredible poetic celebration of the fact that God cares particularly about those who the world does not care about, to the people who the world discards and diminishes and marginalizes and oppresses, and so definitely the understanding of integral mission having to do with what voices do you hear, who do you attend to, and so definitely the issues of land, of injustice, of oppression, of being silenced. I can't help but recognize that having lived through a dictatorship, a military dictatorship in Argentina in my youth, also nourishes this passion to say who is not being heard, what voices need to be highlighted, and what's the contrast between the official stories that are told from the top down and the reality of people from the ground up. So those are all strands that weave together to make me even more committed to highlighting, both to listening myself, but also to bringing up for the attention of others the voices of people that have been silenced through the decades.
Speaking of hermeneutics and the theology of Mary, or interpreting, doing hermeneutics in the context of Mary and the Gospel of Luke, all of the other people in the group are biblical scholars of one sort or another. So let's bring them into the conversation. Gary Burge, formerly of Calvin Theological Seminary, Ross Wagner, a New Testament professor at Duke Divinity School, David Crump, former New Testament professor at Calvin, and Rob Dalrymple, New Testament professor and director of Determined Truth Ministries. We're going to open it up to the rest of you to be involved in this conversation. Rob, why don't you start? What are you thinking right now?
Well, Ruth, we want to thank you again for just being with us today. It's just a privilege to have you join us, and your voice is very, very well appreciated. So I want to follow up a little bit. I'd like to read a sentence to begin with. You spoke at the Lausanne Conference in Seoul 2024. You were one of the plenary speakers. And in that presentation, you described dispensational theology and a particular view of Israel-Palestine, and you challenged the attendees by saying, quote, "There is no room for indifference toward all who are suffering the scourge of war and violence in the world round. The uprooted, the beleaguered people of Gaza, the hostages held by both Israel and Hamas, and their families, the threatened Palestinians in their own territories, all who are mourning the loss of loved ones." Now, we know, and maybe our listeners are aware as well, that you were then censored for that comment in a letter sent to all the Lausanne attendees. Can you kind of recount what happened, and why were you surprised, and were you discouraged, and how did you feel about this?
Oh dear. Yes. I was shocked. To me, my talk was just very basic ABCs of the gospel and the calling to God's people, based on Luke 4 and Micah 6:8, and yes, this. So to me, I was shocked that this was an issue. I couldn't believe it, but. It was fascinating, because what was revealed in that process is how there are interests and even financial interests that move some of these decisions. Because my talk was on justice, the topic I was given 15 minutes to talk about it, and I felt like I did what I was called to do in the limited time I had, and I addressed all kinds of issues of injustice in the world, including what you just cited. But of course, this is what just blew up, was the fact that there were among the attendees, there were people who were disturbed by my calling out dispensational eschatologies that justify violence, and that I would call out particularly the indifference towards the plight of Palestinians. And so I was called in to talk with the head of Jews for Jesus, and I was then, as you mentioned, are we having trouble? The recording says error.
No, we're not having any trouble that I know of. So go ahead. You're good. Thank you.
Sorry to break
no
up.
problem.
But so that I then had to. I decided, as I was called in to and asked to apologize, and I said, "I'm sorry, but I really don't feel like there's anything I need to apologize for." So they apologized in my name or something. They apologized for me. But in that process, I wrote up something to explain what I meant, because one of the pushbacks I got was that, how could I say there were hostages held by Israel? And I said, well, what do you want to call? You could use a different term, but what do you want to call about all these people who have been arrested and held forever with no trial, including children? So anyway, I don't need to go there. But what was fascinating was how, in a way, this just awoke the audience, highlighted my talk, and brought the topic into the conversations at the conference and beyond.
And we will put a link in the comments box after this goes live, after we're finished with this. So if you want to get a link to the YouTube presentation of Ruth's presentation there's also a wonderful article in Sojourners that we'll put a link to that as well. But so let me comment on that then. Has the fallout then from this event brought maybe more attention to the question and to what you had to say? In other words, would you say that the scandal has been helpful in getting
Amen.
the word out to this issue.
Yes, I
And
definitely do. I mean, I think by trying to silence, it was the opposite is what occurred. And so I'm extremely grateful because in many ways, I mean, putting me through the ringer, throwing me under the bus, whatever the expression is, it just brought up the topic and it put it out there for everybody to consider. And people, my talk would have been one among 60 talks at the conference, but then all of a sudden it got brought up. And of course, then the considerations, was she silenced because she's a woman or because she's Latina or what? But so what? So what? What it did is it highlighted the topics of justice, of Palestine. It brought up an opportunity for our Palestinian siblings to talk to the leadership of Lausanne, and a lot of things came out of it. We're actually going to have, as Infamit, next week, Thursday, we're holding a webinar on 15 minutes of justice, a call to faithful witness and lament in the midst of so many injustices that continue being justified in our world.
Ruth, can I ask a question just to follow up with what Rob? Am I on, Rob?
yes.
So can I ask a question just to follow up quickly, Ruth? When your presentation, I had heard also that it had been pre-approved.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes.
When you had your conversation with the executive committee there, how did they answer that? They had read
So
it.
actually, their apology was because one of the things they said in their apology was that they had not sufficiently vetted the talk, because I handed in every last word months before the fact, and they just hadn't caught it. My read of that is that the people who read it didn't feel there was anything out of order in it. But what happened is that when it was spoken in the conference, the audience contained a lot of people who, powerful money people, whose reaction was extremely negative, and that's why the whole thing blew up.
I don't want to jump in more than just to say my wife was there and was giving me live feedbacks on this, and it kind of ignited her, who's been on the periphery of this issue compared to me. Now she's doing all kinds of reading, so that was helpful. If that happened with her, I'm hoping that happened with many people as well. So just a comment, let my colleagues step in.
Yeah. Well, you had a book come out in October-ish last year with some colleagues reading the Bible Latinamente, and I want to talk about that a little bit. In the book, you suggest 3 guiding principles, and I'll quote here. We read sencillamente, straightforwardly, with a simple, trusting faith in the Bible as the Word of God. Secondly, we read together in community, en conjunto. And third, we read en el camino, along the way of daily life, la cotidiana, with the scents and flavors of everyday life, you say. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how this contextual reading strategy has informed your work specifically on justice in Latin America, Palestine, and other settings. How do these descriptors bring the Misión Integral to the Church a particular hermeneutic?
Yeah, so much of Western scholarship happens in kind of select academic guilds, and scholars are supposed to do their research, and it's a very individualistic endeavor. In contrast, in my personal experience and in that of many of us in Latin America, the articulations, the thinking, the provocations, the questions happen in the context of a community that is seeking to live it out. And so instead of academic kind of isolated academic endeavors, we work together in consultations, and our gatherings tend to be I bring in my piece and you bring in yours, and even this book was the product of a collective work. we listen to one another, we question, we push, we prod, and it comes out of communities that are seeking to live it out. So in my case, my community here at Casa Adobe, my community of Infamit, my community of SETI, and now the community at Western, these all shape my engagement with and my thinking, but also my engagement with reality, my living it out. And so that's where it's in the cotidianidad, in the everyday life of having to grapple with differences here in our community, where we have refugee families and we have people of different cultures, and all of that shapes and enriches my perspective on things. And then, of course, in engaging with, and also, yes, the sencillamente part, the straightforwardness, the belief that actually, if the prophets call out God's people because of the way they're living in unjust lives, that actually that is a call for us today too. We don't need to do a whole lot of calisthenics, hermeneutical calisthenics, to say what's there is a call, and that is a call to us too. And maybe some of that simple kind of believing posture, rather than just splicing and dicing and cutting it all up and analyzing it till we take all the life out of it, is part of what is more inspiring and helps build the bridges with the reality of our siblings in Palestine too, and say, this is pretty clear. Injustice, brokenness, apartheid, land grabbing, all of this is it's told. That story is told in Scripture, and we're called to a certain attitude, posture, actions in relation to it. Well, then let's just live it out.
It sounds as though there's a certain courage also that comes from doing this in community, that one realizes, okay, I'm not the lone interpreter, or even the lone voice, but there are other people standing with me and helping.
Absolutely, definitely.
It's exciting. I can't wait to read it with students here at Duke.
Thanks.
Thank you for writing a book like that makes this hermeneutic accessible to a wide audience.
That's the hope, that it really and it encourages our Latino communities in the North to boldly step forth and gift what they have to gift to the broader community.
So,
Great.
Ruth, so of course our conversations, as you know here, have been very much focused on Israel and Palestine. And I've noticed that when Africans are looking at the problems in Israel-Palestine, especially what the Palestinian experience has been, they see peace with their own countries. In other words, they have experienced colonialism in their own world. So I'm wondering if you could just look at when you look at, say, Gaza or the West Bank and what has happened in the last few years, and you look at it through a Latin American lens, what do you see? Because Latin America has a long history with this kind of colonialism. And I think I guess what I'm thinking about is in Africa and Latin America, we've actually used vocabulary about subtler colonialism. Do you think that's what we should be doing with Gaza, West Bank? Is the Israeli project with the Palestinians really a subtler colonial project or something else?
Yes and no. I think, yes, Latin America, definitely. 550 years of now, of course, in the case of Latin America, in contrast to North America, so much of it was not even settler. It was straight out conquest, because the people that came didn't necessarily come with families to establish themselves here initially. They came to plunder and take the riches over to Europe, to Spain, to Portugal, and only later did the settlers side of colonialism begin. But the reality is that still today, the inequity in our societies in relation to the indigenous people groups, their exclusion from all kinds of opportunities in life and such, it's just still very blatant, still very present. And so it does always kind of challenge our comfort as mestizos, as the mixed race people that we are. Now, is settler colonialism the best term? I mean, I think one of
I
them
guess
is
thinking too, Ruth, is when you've made many visits to Palestine, you have a lot of exposure to many leaders there. So when you look at the larger picture of what's happening to the Palestinians, what is the best vocabulary we should use to describe this?
well, there definitely is this, to me, this issue of apartheid that our siblings from South Africa highlight, right? Of just class and race and such segregation and oppression. But when you see how the land grabbing, the settler communities taking over, even the areas that have been established as Palestinian territories, and you look at the progression of the takeover of the land itself, then that's what would explain the settler colonialism terminology. But at the same time, there's so much more, because there seems to be really a seeking an eradication of a people. And so the terms that even Pope Francis has used of genocide in this case might be really, need to be considered in the mix of the decision to just squeeze those people out of the land. What comes to mind to me is like when one wants to get the last bits of toothpaste out of a tube, and it just gets squeezed. So you have examples of families where if there's married to an expat, the expat isn't granted a visa. And so then they're all in exile. And so this constant squeezing out of the place, beyond just occupying the land, it's squeezing the people out of it.
You also have, of course, you just told the story experience of describing this squeezing to large Christian audiences. But you're also using words like apartheid, settler colonial, genocide. These also generate a reaction.
Oh, absolutely.
So all of us who are around you today, we speak to audiences like this.
Mm-hmm.
What should we do about that? Do you think that it's time to just use all of that vocabulary despite the reactions that follow?
Yeah, so for example, earlier we talked about my talk at Lausanne. I did not use any of those terms at Lausanne. I was extremely, I felt I was being very responsible and not being inflammatory and not seeking to just trigger people. I was just naming what we see in the most, I felt, even biblical terms, to say compassion and justice are part of our calling, and people are suffering and needlessly, and that needs to be reckoned with. And there is a complicity in that, because we are not only allowing it to happen, but strengthening, justifying, nourishing that vision because of our theological postures. So I think there is definitely an issue of who is our audience, who are we engaging with, what are our goals, what are our objectives, what is our theory of change, how do we bring people into a new awareness, and I think there are times and places for different vocabularies and different framings, even of the very same reality.
Mm-hmm. So you're being more descriptive, and you're actually avoiding some of the terms that could become a distraction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's my turn now. Ruth, it's good to
Yes,
see you
David.
again. You may recall we met for a while.
Absolutely. Yes, we were at Sabil together just last May.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's good to see you again. I'm sure you're aware, as we all are, that Christian Zionism is growing quite rapidly in the global South, including in Latin America. And I'm wondering if this is something that you've been tracking for a while, and if so, how can you explain the rise of Christian Zionism in Latin America?
I have been extremely aware of this. I lived for several years in El Salvador, and the second largest church in the country is called the Biblical Baptist Tabernacle of the Friends of Israel. And their logo is a menorah. And they have 2, if not 3, yearly pilgrimages to the Holy Land, sponsored in part by the Israeli government. And then just recently, last year, I was in Guatemala, and I was just shocked at the all these local evangelical or Pentecostal or neo-Pentecostal churches flying Israeli flags, even in Guatemala. And then I'm in Lake Atitlan, and there are little Israeli flags on the boats crossing this lake in indigenous communities. And yes, it is so present. Now, one of my theories, and this is very personal about this, trying to understand why these neo-Pentecostal churches are so allied. One of the elements, I believe, is that many of these neo-Pentecostal churches have just kind of sprung out from grassroots movements of the Spirit and of certain powerful leaders. And they do not have a history. They don't have tradition. They don't belong to a denominational family. They are just standalone megas. And we all need a story. We all need a belonging, a sense of rootedness. And so when they go to the Old Testament, they find these traditions and they just make an automatic jump without a whole lot of discernment that the people of Israel are the people of Israel from the Old Testament are the people of Israel today. And so whatever practices and things, then they find roots, they find a place to belong. And so they take on the songs and the shofar and the dances and the flag, and there's just this critical association between the ancient people of Israel and the modern state, with no critical discernment about the difference. That is one of the elements I think comes into play, in addition to the influence of prosperity theologies and eschatological matrices of, we will bring in, Jesus will return once the ingathering happens, and all these other elements. But I think a lot of it is pre-theological. It's not even as deep as some of those concepts are.
Yeah, can you speculate maybe on the influence of Western missionaries in that process, bringing Zionism?
Oh, definitely. The whole prosperity gospel and the dispensational theologies. I mean, Central America, Dallas Theological Seminary, and the expectation of the different dispensations historically has had a lot of influence in Central America, which is one of the places where in my experience, are most Zionist.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Thank you.
So if I could follow up on that, as somebody else who's fascinated by this surging wave of Christian Zionism in Latin America, one of the factors that strikes me is that it's not just individuals interested in their own personal prosperity. If I bless Israel, God will bless me, but it's also entire nations thinking
Yes.
collectively about the
Yes.
possibility of our nation flourishing. And so we even have presidents and heads of state who are speaking this kind of language, expecting God to reward Guatemala or Bolivia or some other country with financial, military, political prosperity if they do their part in this transaction, which is to lend UN and other kinds of support, diplomatic support to the state of Israel. Do you see it the same way, Ruth? Is that aligning
Yes.
with
Yes.
your analysis?
Yes. And you have somebody like the president of Argentina, Milei, who now has his. This is a very historically Catholic nation, becoming less and less so. But here you have Milei, who chooses to have a rabbi as his personal mentor, and he now wraps himself in the Israeli flag and has all the expressions of support and. So yes, this is a huge part of it, is just feeling like allying with Israel as a nation is part of bringing God's blessing to our nation, definitely. Mm-hmm.
So hold on, Ruth. This is actually they're making a spiritual equation here. So the leader of Argentina is saying that God is going to take care of us. This is not really a political calculation that in some manner Israel and America will treat Argentina kinder. But this is an explicit overture to God that since I'm pleasing God by blessing Israel, God will fundamentally...
And by becoming Jewish myself, even in a Catholic nation, that's pretty radical for Latin America.
So really, it's preferencing even Jewish culture as sort of romanticized out of the Old Testament.
Yes, yes.
That's remarkable.
Before we finish today, let's give a brief commercial announcement. Again, thank you, Ruth, for joining us today. If you are watching us, we thank you for watching us here. The Christian Forum from Israel-Palestine tries to have conversations like this, discussing Israel and Gaza and Palestine. If you like what we're doing, please follow us on YouTube, like the channel, leave a comment. That all helps, and share with others on social media. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll be automatically notified about upcoming events and other guest interviews like this. None will be as great as this one here with Ruth, but we want to thank you for joining us today. And if you are watching us live, go ahead and feel free to give a comment in the comments box. And if we have time here at the very end, we'll go ahead and try to do our best to address your comments. So I think, Michael, you want to ask our last question?
I do, but I'm with the forbearance of my colleagues, I want to change it up a bit, just based on something I just saw moments ago, even. In your 2018 address at Christ in the Checkpoint, you called for reconciliation, and given where we are on the ground now, even with the ceasefire, I just wonder about that. And to put some context around how I want to twist this question, Daniel Banura, do you know Daniel Banura by any chance?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, definitely. Yes,
I thought you did. Yeah.
Yes.
He posted on social media a comment in light of the ceasefire, and he's a Palestinian student at Notre Dame in religion, and this is what he wrote. It's not super long, but it's more than one sentence, so just bear with me for a moment. He writes this: I want to celebrate this ceasefire, but I can't. I'm glad that my friends in Gaza can take a breath and collect what remains of their lives, but I continue to mourn for the friends that I lost and the thousands of beautiful souls that were robbed from us. There are no schools or universities in Gaza, no functioning health systems, no homes to go back to. Bodies are still decomposing under the rubble and unaccounted for. Many more will die in the coming days and months from physical and psychological ailments caused by this genocide. The trauma and grief will linger on for generations. Mothers and fathers and children will continue to weep for the loved ones they've lost. There's a ceasefire, but the occupation isn't over. Apartheid isn't over. Systematic oppression isn't over. The constant dehumanization of Palestinians for over 77 years is not over. We gather what remains of our souls and bodies, what remains of our homeland and humanity, We hope, we pray, we persist, we continue to fight for justice and liberation. I thought that was very sobering from him, and properly contextualizing the moment as well. Certainly from within a Palestinian framework, he has friends and relatives directly in harm's way, and some who have been killed and harmed. We're in this moment, and we're called to the work of reconciliation, which you've reminded us of in this conversation. How do you see what you said at Christ in the Checkpoint carrying forward for the work of the church today, now, in light of this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done. The reality is also Gaza is one thing, and a ceasefire there is one thing. But what happens with the West Bank and the onslaught of occupation and burning of homes and businesses and all of that is not in the books. It's not in this treaty, and it's a reality. What about the squeezing out of people and such? What about so the story definitely is not over just because there is, even if this does hold, which is at least we do pray for. I think there is so much to. I think we need to listen to our Palestinian sisters and brothers before we propose solutions from outside. We need to listen, and we need to listen to Palestinians in Israel also. I've been challenged to recognize the different voices of a Palestinian living in Bethlehem and a Palestinian living in Nazareth. Our friend Rula Mansour with her Center for Peace and Reconciliation, and Johanna Catanacho up in Nazareth Theological College. We need to, even there's a diversity of perspectives about reconciliation. Is reconciliation possible? How do you bring justice and reconciliation together? Those are things we can't formulate from outside and impose. We need to learn from them. And so there, for example, as Infimit, in July, we're holding, along with several other organizations, a peace building summit on Palestine and comparative perspective. And it's Palestinians that are going to be speaking mostly. The rest of us are there to continue learning together and having them help us see how to accompany, how to be with, how to voice, highlight their voices, advocate for their agendas, rather than just trying to bring solutions from outside, which will never work anyway.
Thank you. I think there's a real danger, in particular if you grew up evangelical, when someone's been harmed, that you want to tell them very quickly, you need to forgive, you need to forgive. I mean, we've seen this in advice given to abused spouses and so on. This is magnified from that example many times. We have a gospel of reconciliation, but we're also have to listen to how that plays out from within the context. My last follow-up question, unless someone else jumps in, is we're about to swear in again Donald Trump as president of the United States, and he, in the first term, to say he was chaotic around any number of issues, but in particular around Palestine and Israel would be a huge understatement. He's immediately baited Netanyahu with phrases like "do what you got to do" and so on. And what the other part of the conversation earlier about how the church's complicity in this. There's so much of a megaphone among churches like Haggie's church and all that whole movement that will just play right into this. How does the remnant of the church that's trying to be faithful in this, how do we engage this in integral mission? We're fighting we're fighting in our own ranks about how to even be heard. How do we bring integral mission here in the U.S. now?
Yeah, it is. You
10
use the
words or
word
less.
remnant. Sorry?
I said in 10 words or less. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, yes.
All this for us.
You use the word remnant. What does it mean to be faithful witnesses? A call to faithful witness in the midst of these unpredictable times and yeah, the unsettledness and the whole scene that will launch next Monday. Stick with it. Stick with what we're called to be and to do. Do things like what you have been doing. Hold these conversations. Hopefully, some people will begin to listen. Highlight the voices of our friends from over there. Give them megaphones. Work individually. Work in the theological formation opportunities. Just let's not give up. The call is to remain faithful witnesses and to inspire faithful witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ, to the good news of justice and reconciliation. I think we just need to keep on keeping going and not lose hope, even when things really look pretty dark and progress seems so slow. But I think that's what we're called to, is to faithful witness in the midst of it all.
Ruth, is this a conversation that is alive in Latin America, where when the church is living under an autocrat in, say, Latin America, do Christians have these conversations regularly? So what do we do? Do we resist? Do we?
Right. Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. I mean, you do. You have those conversations. When I was, 18, we had the Falklands Malvinas War, and we knew that it was a play of our military dictatorship and the Thatcher regime. And some Christians were, oh, hey, we got to go. We're going to support our military and da, 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 da. And others of us are saying, no, we got to resist. If they call us up to fight, we're not going to fight. This isn't our battle. This is some play between these two oppressive regimes, and we need to create a different alternative. And of course, there are theological strands in the church that would have different postures about war and such, but I think the dialogue between the traditions, an Anabaptist radical alternative one and a reform that is more top down and such, but there needs to be this encounter around the good news of and the calling. I think that's what I summed up at Lausanne. We're sent as Jesus was into the world. What does that look like? Sent as Jesus was into the world. That's what he called us to. So that's what we need to pursue.
Thanks.
Well, again, Ruth, we can't thank you enough for joining us today. And thank you, Michael and Bruce, for arranging all this, and for the rest of the team. And again, we want to encourage you just to subscribe to our channel for more conversations. And we will put the link to Ruth's presentation at Lausanne in the comments box. I cannot encourage you enough to watch that. It's a 17-minute presentation. It's worth at least 35 minutes, which means you can watch it twice. And anyone that gets upset about her comments about Israel and Gaza, there's plenty of other things in there that are very, very powerful, about wealth and about just men and gender discrepancies and differences, and all the things in that presentation were phenomenal. Ruth, we thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for joining us today.
So it's all offensive, in other words, the whole presentation.
Not at all. It is the gospel. It is the best. It is Jesus. That's
well,
he was offensive as well. So, all right, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.
So grateful.
Thank you all.
So grateful.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.